Well, welcome to another edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. My special guest with me today is Dr. Mark Jones. Mark has written many books, Knowing Sin, Knowing Christ, as well as on antinomianism and a host of other topics. But of late, he's written, I think, a very challenging and pertinent article in Reformation Today or Reformation 21 about burnout in ministry. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Mark, welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me on. It's great to be able to chat with you.
Now, Mark, you've written heaps of books on the Puritans, as I said, on antinomianism, legalism, knowing Christ, knowing sin. This particular topic has really touched a nerve I've found with a lot of people. So again, thanks for joining us today. It's great to be able to explore some of the nuances and thoughts with you. What for you, if you could just summarize your article, is at the heart of ministerial burnout?
It's a good question. It's one that I think I felt like answering to some extent, and I think for me, I travel quite a bit. So I've been to Australia and Asia, many countries in Asia, many countries in South America, Africa, Europe, all over the United States. So when I talk about this, I'm not just someone who lives in his office and thinks, oh, what will I write about today? It's something where, you kind of talk to a lot of pastors and you share your experiences. And I think from what I've been able to discern from, close to 2 decades of doing this, that a lot of pastors who do go through burnout will pinpoint that while there can be external factors that are beyond their control, I think that goes without saying. There are sometimes there is sometimes a need for reflection on our part as to how have we possibly contributed to our burnout. And I said in my personal experience, I think the sin of pride, it flowers into so many different sins, pride, as we know, just like unbelief. And so I gave just a few examples of how pride can sometimes cause us more harm in our life, as any sin does, than good. And so it was kind of born from experience, and especially personal experience in my own life. And if people don't see it that way in their life, that's fine. I'm merely recounting my own sort of journey.
Yeah, I mean, I must say your article really resonated with me. I struggle with the same temptation that pride leads to workaholism. Do you think pride can manifest itself in other ways as well?
Yeah, I think, for the ministry, let's give two flip sides. I think the ministry, there's a temptation where things can become very easy for a pastor. He doesn't have to work hard. He kind of maybe gets in cruise control, and pride allows him to take his foot off the pedal to a point where it's ministerial laziness.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, you can have pride where he sees the ministry more about himself, the success of it based upon his preaching, and other things that have to do with him. And so the pride manifests itself that way. So there's just two examples where pride can rear its ugly head in different people in different ways.
Yeah, I must say, as I was reading your article, the verse that, and you didn't reference this verse, you referenced other verses, which I think were very apt. But the verse that kept echoing in my head was Jesus' words in Matthew 11, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And I looked it up again this morning just to refresh it in my memory, and I noticed that straight on from that in Matthew chapter 12, Jesus goes on to go through the grain fields and rebuke the Pharisees who are all upset about their legalistic righteousness about,
Mhm.
rubbing heads of grain.
Yeah.
Um, do you think is it fair to say, Mark, that that's a good principle for ministry, that following Jesus, his
Mhm.
grace is going to be there, his strength is going to be there for whatever trials to come, or is that being too simplistic?
No, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because before I got onto this podcast with you, that verse was something I'd been thinking about immediately before. And,
Wow.
that's the point, is that Christian ministry has certain challenges and difficulties, but at the end of the day, we have to remember that the way God saves us and the life to which he saves us is one of freedom. He doesn't burden us beyond our abilities. He's not a hard taskmaster. He's a gracious and good God. But what Jesus says there, a lot of people actually forget. He still says there is a yoke. It's not a heavy yoke, but there's still a yoke. And we do carry a yoke in Christian living. There's a yoke. It's Christ's yoke, but it is something we carry, and it's something that he gives us the ability to carry. So I think a lot of people focus sometimes on how the words echo, this sort of light way of living, but there's still a yoke there, and we mustn't forget that. And our job, I think, as ministers, when we preach the gospel, is not to make the yoke heavier than what Christ has made it, but also not to make that yoke for ourselves heavier than what Christ has made it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It definitely resonated with me because I think we can put these unrealistic expectations upon ourselves. So many things I want to cover here. There was an article, I don't know if you saw this, by David Pallison a number of years ago, exploring Psalm 131. And I might just read it to you. It's only a very short psalm. It says, "My heart is not proud, O Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me. But I have stilled and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, put your hope in the Lord both now and forevermore." And I thought, oh, wow. Again, as I read your article, I thought, that's it, isn't it? There is this insidious temptation for us as ministers of the gospel to want to make a name for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it is that really integral to burning out, is that we put a yoke on ourselves that
Yeah.
is not the Lord's yoke, but is actually one of, well, like James would say in James 3, one of selfish ambition,
Mm-hmm.
one that is really demonically inspired. Is that a
Yeah.
fair call to say?
Yeah, yeah. I think ministers are going to read the article different than someone in the pew. Uh,
Yeah.
and that's fair. So I think all of us as ministers know that insidious nature of pride, of haughtiness, of hubris, of just arrogance at times, of power, like all of those nasty elements that, Satan is trying to tempt Jesus with an easy way to power and authority and glory. And if he thinks he can tempt the sinless Lamb of God to those things, imagine the attacks that we're going to face, not only from our flesh, but also the devil too. Power, authority, glory that comes in ways that God hasn't, ordained for our good. And I think that's also why burnout happens, is because we think we're taking a shortcut to glory in this life, but it ends up causing us more harm than good. And I think ministers, if they're being honest with themselves, will admit, we do struggle with pride quite a bit, because there's people always telling us, as much as there's criticism and there's a time and place for an article and a discussion on that, there is also a lot of praise that can come to ministers in churches. And we have to be so careful about that.
Yeah, one older minister that I really respect responded on social media to your article saying he thinks there's a real danger, though, in younger ministers today in particular, of being so concerned with self-care, or even what psychologists now call labeling self-compassion,
Yeah.
and seeing that as the antidote to burnout, that it actually could lead to a response to your article, could lead to laziness, could lead to withdrawing from the hard work of ministry, suffering like a soldier, doing the hard work of a farmer. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think I hinted at this in the article, where my solution and my approach, and I remember, we're talking. You write a blog article, and it has to be under 1,000 words for people to actually read it, from what I've been told. So I did hint that the need for the corporate body, the elders, the church, people to be involved in this. This isn't a decision where the minister sort of goes, okay, I'm going to sit around for a while and just, you've got to figure out how do you conduct your ministry in the context where you have accountability from elders who love and care for you,
Yep.
from a wife, for example, who loves and cares, and congregants. And once you start to get those pieces into place, you're going to be in a better position. I could see the arguments where viewing a minister who works too hard and then says, okay, I'm burnt out, I'm going to just take it easy, I would say that's a fair point. But my argument is more along the lines of how do we conduct ministerial care corporately so that the best interests of the pastor are being looked out for by others who see things maybe he doesn't even see himself. And that's where I've had to personally listen to others who witnessed things in me and say, hey, okay, maybe they're seeing things I'm not seeing, and I need to listen to them.
Yeah, I thought you made a number of excellent points, and I'd love to take these in two parts because they're so good. First of all, you talked about the role of your wife,
Hmm.
being that person that knows you best and having the humility to listen to her. But secondly, you also talked about the role of the congregation
Yeah.
in being able to show grace and model grace to their pastor.
Hmm.
Can you flesh that out a little bit more for us, Mark? What does it mean, first of all, to be able to, in a godly way, listen to your wife, listen to the feedback, as hurtful as sometimes it might be?
Sure, sure. Well, I've gone through this a few times now, burnout, and in different levels and ways, and the common denominator has been my wife giving me the warning,
Mm.
Mark, you're doing too much, or you can't do all this, or she'll see things. And I believe that's God's. God doesn't yell down from the clouds every day at us about our daily sort of output and stuff. So what does he do? Well, he in many cases gives us faithful friends or a spouse or whoever to speak into our lives. And so my wife will see things that maybe the congregation doesn't see. She'll see, someone might say, okay, what does the pastor do? And I sometimes struggle to even give a coherent answer because I'm just so involved in, and she'll be like, he does this, he's here, right? So when she starts to see the burnout problems, I think that's the first person I need to listen to because she sees me closest. She sees my emotional roller coaster, or all of those things that I could maybe put on a front to the elders. It's not that hard to be like put on the battle shield and say I'm doing okay, right? And it's
Mm.
easier for me to be open about struggles with my wife. That said, I do think over time, if you develop a good relationship with your elders and congregation, they will pick up on it. I tend to find women in my church, elderly women, are quite in tune to some of my own needs of when I need, and they're always worried. Um, and I don't know what it is, but it's sort of like a sixth sense that they have. They just seem to know, and that's been a blessing to me. Maybe in other churches it's other types, but I've noticed some of the elderly women in the church have been really a blessing to me by picking up on things and asking very pointed questions about how I'm doing. So that comes though from extended ministries. And one of the values of an extended ministry that very few people will talk about is your congregation starts to understand the pastor in a way that a few years doesn't cut it. But let's say 15 years, they'll start to say, hey, he's not himself or this or that. So I think that's one thing we should focus on is when your ministry is such that people start to really understand you as a pastor, not just does the pastor understand his flock, but does the flock understand their pastor?
Yeah, that's a great point. And we could do a whole podcast, I think, just on the value of extended ministries. It's a really great point. And I totally resonate with what you're saying that our wives, well, I know for me, is the biggest earthly blessing,
Hmm.
that she knows me. Um, how do you, how do you, how do you help others that are not in pastoral ministry or even our own spouses when they're starting to feel burnout? Um, how do you minister that way?
Every case I've noticed is slightly different, um, and the reasons are slightly different, and the context, and so it's sort of like a divorce case, right? There's no two cases that are the same. And that's why, just for example, writing the article on it, it's, some people are going to
Yeah.
resonate. But I think, coming back to your point, how do you help people? One of the things that I've found helpful is when somebody shares with me their own story and struggle and sort of the warning signs, but also what helped them, um, what may have hindered them, and things like that. You can explain your story, your experience, and that can be great sort of tonic for the soul when you listen to someone else, because you can go, hey, I've gone through that, and yeah, I'm going through that, and I'm not abnormal, and these feelings I have seem to resonate with the feelings you had, and you got through it, so there's hope for me to get through it. So I think just talking with other ministers openly about it can be very useful for our own, not just struggle, but recovery.
And that really speaks to the heart of pride again, doesn't it? Because there needs to be a humility
Yeah.
in terms of being open. And you mentioned this in the article.
Mhm.
Can you explore and explain a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think humility about, being open about your failings and struggles. My congregation's always telling me that I'm, if anything, they know too much about me. Nobody thinks I'm perfect for sure. And I actually go out of my way to sometimes, be very open about, things, even in people over for dinner, and we'll joke about how I did something so stupid. And I know there's some ministers who come from traditions that lock them into this sort of holier than thou way of living, that, it's as though the minister can't sin or be a real human. And that can be stifling to a minister too, when he can't even be himself. I'm so much myself that sometimes people joke, hey, could you be that sort of staunch Dutch reformed, with all apologies to my Dutch brother, but that this sort of, the dominie, the sort of, um, this guy who's so holy, and I'm just not that sort of type of character. So is that humility? I hope there's at least a little bit of humility where we can be honest about our weaknesses. There's times where we can't reveal to certain people things that it would be unhelpful to them. So that as well is a matter of wisdom. But it can be very helpful to people to see that their minister is open about real struggles that he himself has. And if we really believe we're justified by faith, that Christ is everything to us, and that if we have any strength from him, we should be okay with admitting some of our struggles.
Yeah, that again is such an important theme, isn't it? Particularly in Paul's letter to the second letter to the Corinthians, and about how he boasts in his weakness. In
Mm,
fact, I remember being at a really low point in my ministry early on, and then reading 2 Corinthians 1 and it being like a bolt out of the blue. That we don't want you to be uninformed, brothers, about the hardships we face in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to
yeah.
endure. In fact, we felt in our heart the sentence of death. But then he says, but these things happen that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead.
Mm,
And he talks about the prayers of God's saints being so important in sustaining him. A really excellent point I think you made in the second half of your article was about the role of the congregation.
mm.
Um, Practically, what does that look like, Mark, particularly for a minister to be vulnerable that way and to be ministered to by those that he ministers to weekly?
Yeah, so as you brought up Paul, which is great, in one place he says to the Corinthians, and I've lost the reference right now, he says, he's open wide his heart to them, and he wants them to do the same thing.
Yeah.
It has to be, real love. Since it covers a multitude of sins, it also opens our hearts up to one another. And we talk about love so much, but then practically, what does that look like in the life of the church? So, what does it look like in terms of our congregation? I think navigating the balance between a minister fulfilling his role in terms of the qualifications listed in First Timothy 3, for example, you need to um, have a certain level of integrity and godliness, that you're not going to cause everyone to say, well, you shouldn't be a minister. But on the other hand, you can't take the place of Christ in your sinlessness, the way you act as though you're, don't need a savior. So that's a matter of wisdom, of how much we reveal of our weakness. And I think a congregation that really gets the gospel and understands those things is going to be in a much better position to deal with a pastor who, from time to time, will express a struggle or a failing. But a congregation who doesn't really get the gospel, yeah, you can expect that they're gonna push back hard.
Mm.
And so that's why it's so important to preach the gospel, because it may be the best thing a minister can do for himself. Um, you know,
Yeah, that's an excellent point. It comes back always to the foundation of the gospel, doesn't it?
yeah.
It's just so vital. Vital that we preach the gospel, but we also actually live out the gospel and
Mm-hmm.
not a gospel or another gospel by works.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a lot of people that read your article and I've interacted with, talk about the great pain that they've endured through difficult circumstances, either working with a senior minister that was really difficult or, um, having intense opposition from certain individuals in the congregation.
Yeah.
Uh, and it raises whole issues of bullying. And
Mm-hmm.
another minister made a really good point, I thought, between distinguishing between bullying and burnout.
Yeah.
Um, what are your thoughts there?
So are you talking about the bullying that towards the minister, or the minister's bullying towards the others?
Yeah, no, I'm talking about actually the intense pain that a lot of people in pastoral ministry feel,
Yeah.
that
Okay.
they've had opposition from people in the congregation or maybe from even other ministers or other staff,
Yeah.
and that themselves has caused them to have the effects
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
burnout and
Yeah.
withdraw from ministry.
Yeah. And absolutely, there are external factors whereby a minister, can be opposed sometimes by people who seem to have insane amounts of energy to oppose them. And a minister is running on fumes at times with dealing with so many things. And here you've got this one family or individual whose all of their energy is used to. And I just spoke to a minister recently who's gone through this precise problem, where he feels flattened by what one person was able to do to him. I think that goes without saying, that that's where the burnout is is not a result of sin, when you can find something very tangible. But again, here we have to be careful. The minister shouldn't be the one, ideally in a good church government, bearing that load entirely. I'm very grateful for my elders, where if something has come up, I've gone to them and said, this is the issue, and we respond. It's not, okay, Mark, well, you better go deal with that and write a good email or visit and take care of this. We got checks to sign and things like that. They take the burden on themselves. So I have great elders, and if someone were to oppose me and it was, let's say, unfair, I have no doubt that they would share some of that burden. Not all of it, of course, but they would share some of it so that it wouldn't maybe necessarily crush me. And I think some ministers do get crushed because they get left to themselves. Sometimes the elders can be cowards themselves. They can maybe just want the minute, like all sorts of reasons. So I have a lot of sympathy for that scenario, but I would say the minister needs to cultivate the type of trust and love and affection with his fellow elders, so that when it does come, he's got men there to support him.
Yeah, it's such a great point. And the analogy that comes to mind, and I know you'll really like this one because of your own background, but it's like playing on the soccer field, isn't it?
Yeah.
Part of the burnout is if you're trying to play every position on the field, you're
Yeah.
just going to be
Well,
exhausted.
let's use rugby. I'm in a good mood over South Africa right now in the rugby. So, yeah. And actually, you're an Australian, so maybe we shouldn't. But great
No, go.
point. Great. No,
Okay.
you're right. Great point. Nobody goes into a scrum on their own. You know, maybe Eben Etzebeth could, but there's, you need, and it's actually palpable, right? When New Zealand go down a guy and they have to figure out, who's going to join in on the scrum, because you simply even one guy missing, and you feel the force. And that's the same thing with being a pastor, is if you don't have that support around you, you're going to feel it.
Hmm. Now,
So
Mark, you've written heaps of books, and I mean, I feel like I would just burn out just actually writing, and the amount of research you've done is phenomenal, especially on the Puritans. Um, in I know I'm asking you this off the cuff, but what have you learnt from the Puritans in this regard? Do they ever talk about ministerial burnout?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's a great question. I haven't done as much research, at least I'd like to, now that this topic has come up, into ministerial burnout. I was thinking about Richard Baxter's book, The Reformed Pastor, and it divides opinion. I think Carl Trueman had some nasty words to say about the book, but then Chad Van Dixhoorn wrote an introduction to a recent reprint, and Tim Cooper had edited it, a New Zealand scholar, and it divides opinion. But when you read Richard Baxter's book, you think that is a recipe for burnout if you have to do all of that. But I said to my congregation or my Bible study last week, I said, Richard Baxter in Kidderminster, he's walking down the street and visiting homes, whereas here in Vancouver, for example, I have people spread out where it would take 45 minutes to an hour to get to a lot of the houses in my church just there. So things were a little bit different back then. I think the parish church idea can make it a bit easier to minister and do a lot of things, whereas we live in, like if you were in Melbourne or Sydney, for example, or I suppose in Tasmania, it probably wouldn't be that different, but maybe a little more manageable. Vancouver, it's just wild, this pace of life. So the Puritans, I do read a lot from Owen and Goodwin and Baxter, for example, and I'd need to do a bit more research into things they say. Typically, they're concerned with a lot of young guys trying to make a name for themselves, and Owen talks about that, and he actually talks about how much he studied 20 hours a day and stuff to try and attain. And he said some of his health problems were effects and results of that crazy, intense desire to make a name for himself. Did he make a name for himself? Yes, but he did pay a price. And so there's a place where he laments that, even though he doesn't talk a whole lot about himself. And I think some of the Puritans probably would fall into the same category where they probably overdid it. But one thing we can say with the Puritans is they really did rest on the Sabbath. So maybe that refreshed them a lot more than what we do, because our Sabbath resting is quite pitiful comparatively speaking.
Yeah, I mean, you're touching on, I think, a really important point again, and that is how much, and I don't want to overdo this again, but let's explore this. How much do you think of burnout in ministry today is as a result of a neglect of the Lord's Day?
Yeah, yeah, no, that's I think a question that would be worth thinking about asking, and things like that. For me, I'm in a unique situation right now where we have two sites. We have a site that we started up that was meant to be a church plant, but it just exploded, and it's kind of now almost bigger than our regular church. And I go there at 9 a.m. And then I drive into Vancouver 35 minutes at least for our 11 a.m. service, drive home, which is about 35, 40 minutes. Then I drive back in another 35, 45 minutes in the evening for our evening service. So my idea of rest on the Lord's Day is not quite rest. I wake up on Monday in the fetal position with my thumb in my mouth crying, you know, but I do think that a lot of people, they go to church in the morning, but then they go back to their regular living with driving kids here, this, and they don't ever rest themselves. And maybe that's something we do need to recapture. Even if you're not a strict Sabbatarian, and I have many good friends who aren't, I do think they would appreciate the need for the day still being a day of rest, just for
Mm.
your body.
Yeah, another passage that really comes to mind, and a friend mentioned this to me. It seems so obvious. Is sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is go to sleep.
Yeah,
And he mentions like Elijah after that infamous confrontation with the prophets of Baal,
yeah,
and God
yeah.
energizes him to run, and sustains him with food and water that he's provided. But then he tells him to sleep. Then he
Hmm.
gets up, eats, and he sleeps again.
Yeah,
Can you just talk about? I know this is common sense, but as it's often said, common sense is often not that common, and it's
yeah.
the thing that we need to hear. Can you talk about the rhythms of exercise, diet, rest as part of the discipline of
Yeah.
the ministry and as a way of not burning out?
Yeah, I think that's a great point you bring up. And I take seriously the need for exercise. I grew up like a sports mad family, and I love sports soccer. I played rugby, soccer. I did it all, ran, whatever I could do. And I think, I was just before I did this podcast at the track doing sprints, just because I know sprinting is good for the body and that running doesn't offer. And that's so important, exercise. It's just gives you more energy. It gives you the ability to do your work well because you're not becoming obese. And so exercise. And then the thing about exercise is that exercise helps you to sleep better. So when you sleep well, the benefits are incredible. A lot of times, and then again, someone might say, "Oh, well, so what you're saying is, I don't sleep well, therefore, I'm not exercising, I'm not doing this." Some people don't sleep well just because of their DNA. I get that, but I've noticed that exercising and sleeping well are two of the best medicines that you can take for your general ministry. I even believe in the pastoral nap, and I make no apologies to my congregation if I say, I had a nap in the day, because it's just I needed it, and it refreshed me to work and things like that. So yeah, the sleep. If you can do it, make good use of that blessing. God gives to his beloved sleep, and I think that's something I love, waking up in the morning and having slept through the night and go, wow, I didn't wake up for 2 hours and think about crazy things. It's like, and I've also noticed, as a side point, I love red wine. I hope nobody's offended by that. I really love red wine. I've stopped drinking pretty much, but except on special occasions, and I find my sleep is a lot better now that I'm not drinking red wine as much and I'm exercising. So if you do want to sleep, try changing a few little things in your life, and that might be a helpful cure for burnout.
A couple of questions just to finish on, and they're big. First of all, how do we care for brothers that are burnt out,
Mm.
that have withdrawn from ministry? Because I know a lot of them feel extra isolated, that no one cares for them, no one's approaching them, no one's asking how they're going. Um, yeah,
Mm.
what do we do for brothers that are in that situation? Any words of advice or insight?
I think even just getting a conversation going with them is the biggest thing. How many suffer in silence? So if you've even got a doorway into talking about it, that's where you can start to begin the process. But if they are in denial about their burnout, or if they're in maybe feeling guilty that they feel this way, because one of the things I've felt in burnout is I know I've had to scale back sometimes on like how many people we have over and all that, and then you start to feel guilty. And so I think a lot you just need to talk to people, and they need to be able to have a place where they feel they can talk, and until that happens, it's very hard to help them with the next steps, before you say, hey, how's your eating going, or your exercise, or how's your time off during the week. All of those little questions that are important, until you get a conversation going, you're not really going to be able to help anyone, which is why I think having several pastors in your life that you trust, in the good times, you can turn to in the bad times. So you really got to cultivate those relationships. There's certain pastors I talk to about different things, right? And it's kind of nice because they're not in my church and I can open up to them about something that maybe would be a bit more uncomfortable. So make good use of pastors who are friends in your life for when you might need them when things are not going so well.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And particularly about being intentional about, catching up with older pastors that have, have the runs on the board, have those years of experience. What does that look like on the ground, Mark, for you? Like,
Mm.
how often would you call, or is it a regular thing? Is it scheduled, or is it just as the need arises?
Yeah, I'm not a scheduler guy. Fly by the seat of my pants and everything. So I'll text a pastor, or Facebook Messenger. I have one pastor friend where we chat quite regularly on Facebook Messenger. I have another guy we texting today just about he's had a health issue come up, and I've been talking to him and very concerned for him. Sometimes it's a phone call. Every friend is different. Some friends it's more just easier to text, others phone. It's everyone's different. I don't have a plan. I just make sure I've got 4 or 5, I would say, pastors in my orbit who are friends who I could talk to. And every guy's different as well. They're not all the same in terms of how much I would reveal and things like that. So if you have a handful of close friends as a pastor, you're doing very well, I think. And one thing is another great discussion point would just be pastors and friendships, because it's kind of a weird thing being the pastor, and I find some pastors do lack real friendships.
Hey, there's a great follow-up article.
Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe I'll block Australian audiences from reading my next one. If they get hot and bothered.
No, if we pride ourselves on anything, it's mateship.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
that'll be a very timely article.
Everyone's a mate. Yeah, love it. You can as soon as you say mate, you can say anything after that, and it won't land as hard. It's like you're about to tell someone you hate them. Hey, mate, you know what? I just hate you. And it's like, oh, actually, since you called me mate, I don't feel so bad about it. So that's one thing I love about Australians
Yeah,
is mate.
no, it's true. I mean, one of the things I've noticed about you is that you're very good in utilizing social media. You have a lot of people that really appreciate the stuff that you post. Um, do you ever find that impacts negatively on your mental health? Or have you seen that in other ways for others
Yeah.
and associated with burnout, for instance?
Yeah, I've made so many mistakes on social media. One thing I'm glad I'm not on is Twitter. That would just destroy my life in terms of time and wasting arguing. I can't handle if I see something I don't like, I can't help but just say like that's stupid, but I'm very British, and I don't even mean it like as much as, but you say something and people just see the written word, they don't know the person. So I think I've made mistakes by being too my personality on social media without people knowing who I am. And so they see words and they don't understand the person behind the words. So I think you can burn out because you get involved in things that you really have no business getting involved in. And then people say something about you or to you, and it just takes up time. So I think pastors in this day and age have to be very careful. I've tried to distance myself from a lot of social media interaction, things like that, because I know that it will seep the life out of me. And that comes by sometimes painful reflection and experience, and I'll be the first to admit, I've made some errors, and they've been pointed out, and I've had to own them because I was wrong. Now I feel like I'm at least in a better place to navigate this. But I would say err on the side of less as a pastor, no matter who you are. And some absolutely have to just get rid of it because they really have no ability to handle, criticism and even the flip side. It's lovely to hear the nice comments, and you can read about people saying this and this, and you start to just walk away from the computer saying, "Hallowed be your name, Mark." You just read something nice about yourself, and you're like. So there's also the flip side of the positive can be also seep life out of you.
Yeah, it's very true. I have a really good friend who's a minister, and I keep asking him to write for the National Journal because I'm the convener of the Australian Presbyterian, and
Yeah.
and he says no, my ministry he feels is to comment on social media, but he comments in a way which is so edifying.
Okay.
It's considered, it's constructive, and indeed, I put your article on a private Presbyterian Facebook group, and I must say the comments were really they were robust, but they were engaging in a way that you came away feeling edified.
Hmm.
Oh yeah, there's more to think here, and again, I think you make a good point that uh, another minister, a friend of mine, used to say, "Be careful what you post or what you say in an email because text is a blunt instrument.
Yeah.
You don't get the non-verbal body
Mhm.
language, and having met you before and known you, and then reading your article, I'm thinking, oh, it would be very easy for people to take it one way.
Yeah.
But knowing who you are as a person, I go, oh no, he's just making one point, and I'm sure he understands there's nuance and there's
Yeah,
complexity.
that's the danger. You really can't write anything. It dies the death of a thousand qualifications. And even preaching, I've said to my congregation, like, okay, I know that, you know, like going to church and the value of being at church. I said, okay, do I have to list the 100 qualifications? You've just had your leg chopped off by a saw and you can't make it. And, pastor said, oh, I've sinned. There are some things that are so obvious that, but there's a time and place to raise an issue of what could cause burnout, not the issue. And pride is an issue that we have to reckon with. And if people want to offer other reasons for burnout, I would love to hear them. And I know there are other reasons, but sin, we have to understand, sin is sneaky, it's devilish, it will, and it is always present, and it manifests itself in 1,000 different ways, and we need to accept that, I think.
Yeah, and look, amen. And I want to say personally, thank you for your article. I thought it really ministered to me. I know it ministered to a lot of people. I'll make sure I click a link to the article in case you're watching or listening to this, so that you can read what Mark said. I think you did get to the heart of a very important truth that I think, particularly as pastors, we're often reluctant to acknowledge, and that is what C.S. Lewis would call the great sin of pride. And it's ugly, particularly to admit that as a pastor,
Yeah.
and that you are, like James says in chapter 3, motivated by envy or selfish ambition, wanting to be the famous preacher, wanting to have the bigger church, wanting to write the famous books
Yeah. Yeah.
on the Puritans
Yeah.
and things
Well,
like that.
it's true. And, I'm just thankful for, the mercy of Christ, thankful that he does make my life easier the more I trust in him, and not easier to the point of antinomian like living, but easier to the point of trusting in him is always the best way. And putting him first is always the best way. And if we can get more people to relinquish themselves and put Christ where he belongs, they're going to be better off. And that's, ultimately my goal is for myself to be better off. And I know that comes when I'm less and he's more.
Amen. And look, that would be an awesome place to end on. But I have to ask you one more question because you've written a number of books. They're all really important. What's the next project that is on the computer?
Well, I finished Pilgrim's Regress, which the book's supposed to be out any day now. That's on backsliding and apostasy and the Christian life. And after I finished that, I'd been in the Philippines. I'd finished that book. I'd also been to South Africa. I hit a bit of a skid, and I haven't really engaged in any writing projects since March. That's how long it's been. But I do eventually, and now I have less energy than I've ever had for these things. I used to be able to write where it was easy. Now it's not, it's painful. So I do want to write a book like on the attribute of God's goodness, the goodness of God. And it's, Charnock has a discourse on the goodness of God. It's still pretty meaty. I'm going to try and bring something down to bite size, 40,000 words, a small book on the goodness of God. R.C. Sproul did that, the book on the holiness of God. And I think there's need for like an attribute of God to be put out there in a way that's pastorally reflective. And so that is an idea.
Why do you think? Why do you think the goodness of God as an attribute is so important for us today, Mark?
I think the goodness of God, it's for me, it's not just the goodness of God to me, but the goodness of God to this world is incredible. There's people who are Muslims, Hindus, atheists, and I'm just amazed at God's goodness to them. And I would love for them to see his goodness to them. And it's his love to them, his goodness to them is beyond our imagination of what we could even conceive. And so I kind of want to, take not just the goodness of God to us as individual Christians, but sort of blow it up into how good is God. and his goodness to the animals, his goodness to this creation that he's made, and as reflective of something that we can just look forward to even greater manifestations of his goodness in the new heavens and the new earth. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to say on it. And I think surprisingly, ways we should consider his goodness that we've never really considered, and make that such that it endears our devotion to him on a daily basis. How do we love God more? Understand his goodness better.
I wonder too if it's actually the antidote to burnout, because I interviewed a missionary to Thailand just a couple of weeks ago, and I said, "What keeps you going?" And her answer really surprised and stunned me. She said, "Gratitude.
Mm.
I keep looking at all the ways God has been good to me,
Yeah.
and that's what keeps me going." Would you agree? Is
Yeah,
that too simplistic?
no, I think the Christian life is meant to be simple, and it's simply, one whereby if we're not thinking daily about God's goodness, we're missing out on a whole, and we're going to replace those thoughts with other thoughts, and that's not usually good. So I think, thinking on God's goodness will push out negative thoughts, and negative thoughts can cripple us, which is why burnout happens, is a lot of negative thoughts as well. So the more happier and content we are in God and who he is, and also our hope that he's going to continually be good to us, that can put you at ease in the Christian life. And I think we need to be put at ease by who God is.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Mark. Thank you again for your article. Thanks for all your books that have been such a
Pleasure,
blessing.
pleasure, pleasure.
Every
Thank
blessing to
you.
you, and great to see how the kingdom of God is growing in Canada.
Yes, yeah. Slowly,
It's
but
exciting.
it's slowly, but it's growing.
Fantastic. And look forward to reading your new book, The Pilgrim's Regress,
Yes.
put out by who's the publisher?
PNR. Yeah.
Fantastic. The big boys.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much. And I hope you've enjoyed this episode of AP's Profiles in Christian Living as much as I have. And I look forward to seeing you next time.